Hi, Manuel, and welcome back to Berkeley.
Thank you, Umesh.
Yeah,
it's really nice to be here.
Great. It's really.
You got this weather especially for me?
I think so. It's not like this often. So it's really an honor to interview you for this
thank you.
series, and so I wanted to start by asking you about both your current research on consciousness, but also its roots in the past. What motivated you to get into this sort of research?
So, yes, what motivated me was the fact that as a kid, when I was 6 years old, I was a very dumb kid. And I wanted to be smarter. And I was after my father to tell me how to be smarter. And at some point, after I pestered him enough, he got very exasperated and said, you should study the brain. If you understand how the brain works, you can be smarter. And I thought, that's a terrific idea. That really set me in the direction I wanted to go. I'm very grateful to him for that. But that didn't make me a smart kid. I was still a dumb kid for quite a while. I remember also when I was we moved a lot. So I can pinpoint my memories by where I was living at the time. And so between the 3rd and the 5th grade, I remember being outside trying to think of how my brain works. It bothered me that we don't have a manual for driving this device. And I wanted to understand it better, so I really introspected. And the best I could do is, what came up was this idea that I later discovered is called a homunculus, this idea that there's a small Manuel, in this case, inside my brain that's looking out through my eyes, and it's doing all the thinking. Mm-hmm. And I knew that this can't be an explanation because of the recursive nature.
Even at that age.
Yeah, you don't have, 4th grade is just fine for that.
Yeah.
You know that that's not right.
So, in many ways, this early story, it seems to have been echoed in, anybody who was advised by you, like I was, can relate to that in the sense that, it always seemed like your advising style had these elements where you would slow us down, and then it was, but at the end of that you'd come up with some very deep insight. So
you have to understand that I was still a very dumb kid, and I had to slow you down because otherwise I couldn't understand what you were saying. And it really helped a lot. I mean, it's still the case that almost everybody's neurons fire at twice the speed that mine do. And when I give a talk, the worst part is sometimes at the end when somebody speaks very rapidly. Mm-hmm. Nothing gets in. In my classes, somebody will speak and I have to ask some other student to translate for me. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Just to get it to the point where I can understand what they're saying.
My memory is I'd come in and I'd talk to you about some idea, and you'd find it. It was you'd be very very happy with it, and then I'd come in the next week and I'd explain
the same idea.
It was more or less the same. But it was so encouraging. Yeah, no, it was a big just this way of keeping attention on an idea for a very long time until the next step was ready to be taken.
So Mike Zipser, once I heard him explaining to somebody what it was like to have me as an advisor. He said I would see him once a week. We had a set time. He'd come in, tell me an idea. That was good. But then over the week, he didn't have any more ideas. So he'd come by and he'd tell me the same idea. And it was still still just as interested as I was before.
So actually, backing away from there, you know that you have the reputation for being probably the greatest advisor in theoretical computer science, or maybe all of computer science. So, what's the what are the secrets to advising that you
You notice that I'm sort of dumbstruck here.
Yeah.
If I ever find out, I would let you know. I did write this advice to a graduate student.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Maybe a lot of it is that the students I advise are students that I feel a rapport with.
Yeah.
A close rapport. I enjoy them. Hopefully they enjoy me. If we have that enjoyment, then of course whatever it is we're looking at will be a pleasure.
Yeah.
I think you once mentioned to me the pleasure principle. It's
Yeah.
very important to recognize these things that give you pleasure. And
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Great. So going back to where we, the start of your exploration about the brain.
oh yes, I told you about the fourth grade, I guess.
Yeah.
Fifth grade.
So later, when you were, as you went along, did this follow you as you went through?
No, it's something I've always been interested in. So when I went to MIT, I was a very bad student there, just like I had always been all my life. I wanted still to be smart. Mm-hmm. And so I took a course with a professor, a humanities professor named Richard Schoenwald, whose PhD thesis was on Freud. And that was something that at the time I thought maybe that would give me some idea of what's going on in the brain. And that was helpful also in that he suggested, I was with him, when I was a junior, he suggested there's a wonderful person here that just come named Warren S. McCulloch, Dr. Warren S. McCulloch, and you should introduce yourself to him.
Mm-hmm. So was he a young faculty member?
He was probably about 60 years old at the time. Okay. Long beard, very thoughtful, very wise. He taught me a lot, really. He was my mentor, really. Mm-hmm. And it was just great working with him. And he was a neurophysiologist. His interest was in the brain. Mm-hmm. He and his mathematical sidekick, Walter Pitts, are the ones that defined the formal neuron. Mm-hmm. Theirs was the definition. Yeah. And their theorem, this is 1942 or 43, their theorem was that with these formal neurons you could build a circuit that would be a Turing machine. You give it a paper tape and it would do everything that the Turing machine does. And at that time, that was pretty interesting. Yeah. And he was somebody, having come out from Freud, he was somebody who hated Freud. Mm. He hated Freud. Where Freud had written a paper called The Future of an Illusion, he wrote one called The Past of a Delusion, where he was referring to psychoanalysis as a delusion. His paper actually had some interesting points to make. He pointed out, for example, that the Freudian tries to find out about your past. He delves to find out the past. But the truth is that we know from automata theory that given the current state of the automata and the input, you can determine the future. But even if you knew the input from the current state, you could not determine the past. Yes. So it was another example. Yeah. And probably the most important one was that he said that a circuit built, that the neurons had to have inhibition as well as excitation. Mm-hmm. He was adding up, and you have to have both positives and negatives. And he could prove that you must have that for the formal circuit without the inhibition could not do this. And at the time that he said this, the neurophysiologists shook their head no. No, we've never seen that inhibition. But he kept pressing them, and so they looked, and they found it.
My goodness. That's a deep idea.
Yeah, the first sight of it that I heard of was a neurophysiologist, Fetishin, who said that in the goldfish retina, there's this neuron that has many inputs and one big fat one. And the signal comes along this big fat one, it stops that neuron cold. That was very nice.
I see.
In fact, that's enough inhibition. If all neurons had just that, it would be enough. But then later they found that, no, there really is excitation and inhibition.
So how did this interest in the brain then color the rest of your research moving forward?
So when I came into McCulloch's lab, after I was accepted, I was able to prove a theorem, I was accepted, and then without having to read all he wanted me to read, I was accepted, and then I, at some point, garnered the confidence to tell him I really wanted to understand consciousness. And he and Walter Pitts said, no, you will not work on consciousness. And then Walter Pitts took me over and said, look, EEG has to go through this thick a skull to get to what's generating signals. We simply can't do the experiments, and without the experiments, we don't have the data you need. That wasn't completely true. There were surgeons, like at the time, who were opening up brains, to find where the epileptic fits were coming from, and they discovered some things. But by and large, we couldn't get the data, and so I was not allowed to look at consciousness, which still bothers me, because even what I'm doing now is a very formal model of the brain. It's not the real brain; it's a formal model, and I think I could have done it then too, but I was not allowed to look at that problem.
I see. So was recursive function theory then a natural alternative or a fallback? Or?
It was, it was a natural. You have to understand that at the time, logic and recursive function theory were considered pretty important.
Yeah.
Walter Pitts actually ran away from home when he was 14 years old. So I said it's McCulloch and Pitts, and Walter Pitts ran away from home, found his way to Chicago, 14-year-old, and he was walking in the park and met a guy named Bert. And they started chatting and talking, and Bert turned out to be Bertrand Russell.
Oh my God. Yeah.
And so Bert told him about this logician in Chicago that he should go see, much like my professor told me I should go see McCulloch. And so Walter read the work that this person had done and went to see him. What's his name? He was a logician at Chicago. It escapes me, but it'll come. So Walter went to see him, and the logician, whose name escapes me now, describes it like this. This young man came to see me, and he had a copy of my book, and he said that on such and such a page, he found something that was not clear to him. Now you have to understand that when I say that something is not clear to me, I mean it's garbage. So we opened the book to that page, and I read it, and it was not clear to me either. It was Walter Pitts. Walter was really good because he was the mathematician, and he's the one that essentially told me that anything you want to know, you can get from books. I guess nowadays it would be anything you want to know, you can Google for it and get. Very few things that you can't find. Very few. And of course, those things that you can't find, that's research.
Yes. Yeah. And so, when did you come up with the Blum axioms for abstract complexity theory?
Let's see. So that was McCulloch, but I did go into mathematics and logic and recursive function theory. I could only take one course at a time. This was unheard of there. I mean, students were expected to take several courses, and most of them took 2.
Yeah.
And even Lenore, when she was a student at MIT, she started off with 5, but then dropped to 4, and then dropped to 3. I came at it the other way around. The minimum required 2. So I take 2 and drop 1.
Yeah.
And that way I could actually get into something.
Yeah.
And it's, in some ways it's terrible because there's all sorts of things I did not learn. But the stuff I learned pretty well. And that was this recursive function theory, this logic and recursive function theory, which at that time I thought would be the right mathematics for understanding the brain.
Yeah.
I wouldn't suggest it now,
Yeah.
it's not the right, but at that time that was what I did. And so from that, I did this complexity theory.
And was that while you were still at MIT?
Yeah, that was first year PhD student.
I see. Oh my goodness.
Yeah. Good.
And then what brought you to Berkeley?
Lenore graduated.
Yeah.
Was one thing, but what really brought me, Lotfi Zada here invited me to come, and that was wonderful. That was wonderful. Well, what brought me here is I got a job.
Yeah.
That was very nice, and I was an electrical engineer, so going into an electrical engineering department was the right thing for me. I liked that. My PhD was in math, but I never felt like a mathematician. I was an electrical engineer. I still had this, okay.
And so when I got to Berkeley in '81, you had already started this new period with number theoretic, cryptography and thinking about mental poker. And so this seemed like a new phase in your thinking.
Yeah, so you know, people ask me how I teach my students. They don't seem to understand that I'm learning from the students.
Yes.
And I mean that very seriously. Gary Miller was interested in number theory and in its applications, and really the idea of the complexity of these number theoretic functions, that's something he knew about. And he dictated to Dana Anglin, and Dana Anglin wrote it up, and that's how I got into it, and I found it very interesting. I guess part of what got me into it also is there was this terrible thing that happened to me, that they made me the associate chairman for computer science.
Yeah.
I tried to tell them that that's not a good thing because I wouldn't be very good at it, but they insisted. And so I was, so as associate chairman, I made a point every morning of spending 1 hour on what I liked, number theory. So this was after Gary Miller. I spent an hour on number theory, and some days I couldn't because the life of a chairman can be very busy. But nevertheless, I did try to spend 1 hour, and I think that was the best thing I could do. I could completely switch over.
So when did you stop being chair?
I think it was 1980.
Okay, so it was, right. And
then,
that's when you took this up more.
Then I could switch over to the cryptography and the
Yeah.
beautiful number theory that it uses.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was very wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
And it was also wonderful that Derek Lamer was a professor here in the math department.
Mm-hmm.
So there were some people here.
Yeah.
And, you know, Len Adelman had already, or around that time, or maybe a little later, when Dick Karp came out with his NP-complete problems, and Len Adelman began to show that there are these number theoretic problems that are NP-complete.
Yeah, that was maybe a little earlier than that, possibly. Yeah.
Sometime around then.
Right.
But it was really Gary Miller that
that
got me into the number theory. It was wonderful because I loved the number theory.
Mm-hmm.
It was wonderful.
Right.
And I liked what came out of it. You know, I liked this whole knowledge, this whole idea of zero knowledge proofs, for example.
Yeah.
The idea that I can convince you that a theorem is true in such a way that you cannot turn around and convince anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
You know, to a mathematician like Derek Lamer, he said, that's crazy. You can't do that.
Yeah.
He was constantly trying to teach me what a proof is.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, I was a logician. I knew what a proof was. This was a wonderful concept, a wonderful notion.
Yeah.
So I really liked that. And I guess that was zero knowledge proofs work that Sylvia Macaulay and Shafi Goldwasser came up with a definition for it.
Yeah.
And that, see, again, an example where I'm learning from the student. Silvio told me that, yes, I had always said, you know, the theorems and the proofs are the important thing. Silvio says, no, it's the definitions that are important.
Mm-hmm.
It's the definitions.
Mm-hmm.
And he has made a point of getting good definitions that have worked.
Yeah.
So even, you know, the whole notion of zero knowledge proof, you know, it sort of sounds like the proof is convincing you that a theorem is true, but giving you no other information. Mm-hmm. That's what it is. That's not true. It's not true. I mean, you do get other information. If I give you a zero knowledge proof, there's a certain amount of talking that we have to do. Mm-hmm. And by the time you're done, not only are you convinced it's true, but you also have a bound on the length of the proof.
Sure. Sure.
And so you have some information about it, how long the proof is. That's useful. Mm-hmm. And you also have some more information, like the fact that I know it.
Yeah. Yes.
So what I learned from this was, you know, you define something like zero knowledge proof. You make a definition, and then you study it. Mm-hmm. And it's making the definition is really the important thing, getting it clear.
Right. Yeah.
So that I learned from Silvio.
Mm-hmm. That was a very special time here in Berkeley. You know, this whole exploration that you started, and then Silvio and Shafi, and there were all these other students around. It was quite a wonderful time.
It was a wonderful. It was a very wonderful time. Yeah.
And now you're off on, you know, another adventure, which seems really completely open-ended and.
Now I'm back to what I really wanted to know about.
Yeah. So can you say a little more about it? And, you know, how ambitious are you about it? And, you know, what would it mean to, you know, again, is there? So you talked about getting the right definitions.
So that's what I want. I want. So this is work that Lenore and I do together. Mm-hmm. You know, in cryptography, the way work is usually done is one person comes up with algorithms and the other one breaks. It's very important to have somebody to talk to on the other side of the fence. Right. And so Lenore and I are doing things like that. We are. And and remembering what Sylvia taught me, I decided, look, I can't go in and do. I can't go into brains. I'm not a surgeon. I'm not going to use fMRI. But I'm a theoretical computer scientist. What can I do? I can create a formal model to try to understand consciousness. And some people like John Anderson at Carnegie Mellon will tell me, you can't make a simple model. I will after a simple model. He says, the brain is very complicated. Mm-hmm. It's got all sorts of stuff. It's all sorts of stuff that it pasted and glued together. Mm-hmm. You can't do this. And Lenore's response to John Anderson is, you don't understand. We want a simple model that we can understand, that we can prove theorems about, and where we can make our definitions. And once we've done this, you'll be able to tell if this model is any good or not. Mm-hmm. You'll be able to tell from whether or not the definitions are good, whether or not they concur, they agree with what we think. Mm-hmm. And so this has already started because, so without going into the definition of this formal model, one of the things that comes out of it is a definition of consciousness. That's part of what comes out of the model. And another specific thing is the notion of a chunk. Mm-hmm. So the psychologist there was a George Miller who talked about chunk for the first time. He said our working memory can hold at most 7 plus or minus 2 chunks. Mm-hmm. Yeah. He never defined chunk.
Yes. Yeah.
So what's a chunk? When this paper, he said, well, a chunk is like a digit, mm-hmm. or a letter, mm-hmm. or a word. It can be a word. And actually, if you know a poem, it could even be a poem. Mm-hmm. He didn't define it. But from the model, it becomes very clear that a chunk is a pointer. Mm-hmm. It's just a pointer to that letter, that digit, that poem. We all learn the alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Yeah. It's a pointer to the start of that, and once we are there, we can reel it off. Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of proud of that we have, at least in the formal model, a definition for what a chunk is. Mm-hmm. And you can have at most 7 plus or minus 2 chunks, and in the model it's a constant, so yes. A constant number.
Yeah. I see. So how far, so you're trying to pin down this model.
How far are we?
Yeah, and what do you do to pin it down? So obviously, you're looking at, you're trying to fill in this model, but you have a lot of considerations in mind. You're looking at a lot of things and then saying, in order for these things to be true, what should this model look like? And so you have.
It's taken a while. I mean, I think we started off with something that was a bit too complicated. Yeah. We put into it what we felt would be enough to be able to define consciousness and chunk and other concepts like that. And then part of our time has been getting rid of, I don't need this. Mm-hmm. I don't need that. So if you look at my talks from a couple years ago, they're more complicated models. Mm-hmm. And we've been able to get it down to something that I think is close to manageable. Mm-hmm. Am I there? I'm particularly interested in trying to understand the agony of pain. Mm-hmm. The fact that when we tear a ligament, we feel this tremendous pain. Well, that's my interest. Lenore, on the other hand, is really interested in joy. The joy that you get when you hear a beautiful piece of music, or the joy of first love. These are things that it's hard to imagine a robot being able to feel these things. And so my interest is to really be able to get at these feelings. What is it in us that's causing these feelings? And she's trying pain, and she's into trying to get to answer the question, what is it that's causing these feelings of joy?
And are you viewing this as a heuristic, as a machine model? That how does the brain keep track of this, and why does it keep track of it? And
so in our model, we do have an explanation for how pain is generated. I'm not happy with the explanation for joy, mm-hmm. but we have an explanation for pain, and Whether or not this is right very much depends on whether it agrees with these examples that we find. By the way, it would be very good to know if a person is simulating the agony of pain or really feeling the agony of pain. Doctors right now don't know how to tell. They have these faces. 0, very happy. 10, tears. Where's your pain? And they're hoping to be able to get from fMRI and other such things some notion of how much pain you have, but so far that hasn't worked. They don't have a good way to tell. And when somebody comes into the doctor's office and says, I have a pain in my shoulder, the doctor doesn't know, does he really have that pain? Or is he wanting just to get the pills so he can sell them on the street?
Right.
And one of the things that I think a good definition, a good understanding will give us, I'm hoping for, is a way to distinguish between the one and the other.
And the reason you want to distinguish is because, presumably because the real thing is a better heuristic for going through life, that somehow it makes a difference whether it's simulated or not.
It makes a difference, right. And that's a beautiful thing too, that I can point to a disorder that some people have called pain asymbolic, where a person who's born with this knows about the pain, knows that the shoulder hurts, knows maybe it's exactly where, how much pressure, everything that you would know, but doesn't suffer. Doesn't suffer. And the kids that are born with this disorder rarely live past the age of 3. You need to actually feel that pain in order to do the right thing.
And it's not, is it that it's not just that the kids don't live past it, but even if they got to a greater age where they were cognitively more,
where
able
they
to deal,
know English and can speak to you about it.
And then would it still not be effective? Just knowing that you feel pain is still not good enough to navigate through life. It really has to be.
It needs something more.
Yeah.
It needs something more. So the example is this beautiful girl with pain asymbolic. You see pictures of her when she's born. She's beautiful, and the parents really wanted her to live. By the age of 3, they had to remove all of her teeth because she was biting her tongue and her lips, and it was terrible. And by the age of 7, she understood the importance of pain, and her parents had told her, when you notice that pain, because your pain asymbolics do know about it, they know it. When you notice it, you must stop what you're doing and come home and deal with it properly. And so this girl was out playing ball, and her leg must have gone into a hole in the ground, and she broke the leg, and she knew she had broken the leg, and she knew that her parents made the point that she must go home, but she was having fun. And so now when you see pictures of her, you see one leg is shorter than the other. So,
I know stories of elite athletes who've played on through injuries, but with poor end to those stories eventually. Yeah, but that's a good point. So eventually, once you have, now that you are converging on a model, what would you hope to do next with this model of the brain and consciousness, or this aspect of it for pain? Where would you want to take it next?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So one thing that comes out of this is the question of what do you need in order to be conscious? What sort of... So the model has that you're conscious of just a very small amount of stuff, the stuff in working memory, and that your long-term memory is all of these processors that are doing work for you, and that you're really not conscious. You have no idea of how they work through consciousness.
Maybe can I ask a slightly different question?
What happened? See, boom.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Perhaps just to get a slightly different question. So, at some level, one of the questions about consciousness one could ask is why consciousness? What purpose does it serve? So is that the starting point of your model, or is it something that would get eliminated as a consequence of the model?
Yeah, no, I think it's a real thing, and the intent of the model is to be able to explain it, as well as to explain these emotions that we have, and a lot of what. So this gets back to what I was trying to say. A lot of what comes out of this is you can ask yourself, what do you need to have in order to be conscious? Yeah. Do you need to feel pain? No, because there are people that don't feel pain, and that are conscious. Do you need to be able to speak? No, because there are people that don't speak. And Helen Keller could neither see nor hear, and she was conscious. So you don't need these. So you try to cut back to what you need. Yeah. There's a huge piece of our brain is the cerebellum. It's got half the neurons in our brain, half. And some people are born without a cerebellum, and they are conscious. They without the cerebellum, they learn to walk, but it takes them longer, and they can't play the violin. And there are many things that they can't do that require fine tuning, but they are absolutely conscious, completely conscious. Oh. Yeah. Talking about, so part of what we do is, what do you absolutely need to have in order to be conscious? And we can point to one thing after another that you don't need in order to be conscious. And we've come up with 3 things. I'm sure there are many more, but 3 important things that you need for consciousness. And one of them is a model of yourself. A way to distinguish yourself from the rest of the world seems to be an important part of this. And people who lose that are, in some sense, beginning to lose consciousness.
Was that the reason for going into recursive function theory? This notion?
That self-awareness.
Yes.
How wonderful! Thank you. Well, it's a good point. I mean, it's nice to have a theorem that a Turing machine can, on a blank tape, print out a copy of itself. Yeah. That's so that's one of the things. There's another thing which is inner speech. So I've spoken to people who are mute. They don't hear, they don't speak, but they have sign language, and they tell me that they speak to themselves in their brain using sign language.
Oh my goodness!
Yes, that was very nice that they could tell me that. So those 2 things, and there is another thing which I call motivation, where that there should be something you want to do, desire, and the energy to do it. So those are the 3 things that so far we've decided are really essential. And one of the nice things is that the psychologist has a test for consciousness, which who knows how good it is, but we discovered after we had come up with these 3 things that, wow, their test does reflect these 3 things. It's called the mirror test. You dab their forehead with some paint. They don't see it until they get to a mirror and they see it's on them, and they try to take it off their forehead, and that's the mirror test. And for the psychologist, it's the mirror test which determines whether or not they are self-aware.
I see.
At the very least, self-aware.
Yeah. Very interesting.
And it's not a very good test because, a gorilla does not pass the mirror test. Okay. Because a gorilla will not look another gorilla in the eye. This is a very...
I see. It could be dangerous.
Yes.
I see. That's fantastic.
And dogs don't really respond so much to mirrors, but the test has been modified so that it's a smell test. Yeah. There is now, relatively recently, a kind of smell test. where you see that the dog recognizes its own odor and distinguishes it from others. And it's very nice. And it gives you a sense of how very, the sorts of animals that can have this self-awareness. There's now been found that there are some ants that have it.
I see.
There are Myrmica ants, 3 species of Myrmica. You paint the plate on the front, and you let them walk past the mirror, and once they see it, wow. And you see the ant can do something we can't do. It'll walk up on the mirror to look at itself carefully. It does not try to take the paint off the ant in the mirror. It recognizes that it's on itself, and then you see it rubbing with its own self and rubbing against the sides of the mirror to try to remove
that's
it.
Very interesting.
And the same thing is true with a fish. There's a fish called the cleaner wrasse, which for various reasons was believed to be a good subject for this. And it too, you can paint it and it will see it and it will try to get rid of the paint on itself, not on the mirror, not on some other fish, just on itself.
Yeah, great. So just switching topics, how is it to be back in Berkeley? It's been a while.
It's nice. Yeah, it's been a while.
Yeah, but given that you're, have you ever thought about, given this very creative period you had here in the 80s, and now that you have embarked on this big project of coming back, and
which is really important to me, and well, Berkeley is nice. Fortunately, Carnegie Mellon was very nice too, because Carnegie Mellon had, Alan Perlis.
Oh yeah.
To start with, Lenore's took the first computer science country given on the planet from Alan Perlis.
Yes.
And they had Newell, Alan Newell, and they have John Anderson. These are the people that, cognitive psychologists that really know about this stuff. So it's very nice being there and working on this. And being back in Berkeley is also, of course, very nice, very special.
Well, it's really wonderful to have you back. I always, of course, when I came here, you were a big part of the CS here and all of the environment, and so I always think of it as you as a part of the scene here, and so it's really wonderful to have you back here, and an honor to interview.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.